On a cold, moonlit night in a small, forgotten town, silence blanketed the rows of gravestones under the gentle sway of leafless trees. The cemetery, surrounded by iron gates that creaked under the soft breeze, held whispers of memories, of laughter, love, loss, and final goodbyes. It was in this solemn place that an uninvited guest, weary and thin, made his quiet appearance. His name was Terry, a stray dog with a coat that had long lost its luster and eyes that spoke of hardships and loneliness. Terry had roamed the town for years, unnoticed, a shadow flitting between alleys and garbage bins. He was no one's companion, yet he knew the essence of loyalty buried deep within his bones. As the seasons changed, so did Terry's shelter. Some days it was an abandoned shed, other nights the hollow space under a porch. But this night, drawn by an unknown force, he made his way to the old cemetery. The air was dense with the scent of pine and wet earth. In the distance, the town's church bell struck midnight, resonating across the graves. Terry's paws crunched softly on the gravel path as he wandered deeper into the cemetery, weaving between tombstones, some cracked and worn by time. But one grave, fresh and adorned with flowers yet wilting in the cold, held his attention. He approached it hesitantly, his body tense as if expecting to be shooed away by some unseen force. No such force came. The grave belonged to a young man named Samuel, known to everyone in the town for his kindness and generosity. Samuel had grown up here, often bringing food scraps to the strays and whispering stories to Terry on lonely afternoons when no one was watching. Though their bond was silent and fleeting, it meant the world to a dog that had known only isolation. Terry circled the grave, sniffing at the freshly turned soil as if hoping to find a remnant of the warm, gentle soul he had once trusted. His heart, fragile from years of rejection, seemed to break once more at the realization that the only human who had shown him kindness was now beneath this cold earth. He lowered himself onto the ground, eyes fixed on the gravestone that bore Samuel's name, and stood guard as if claiming the role of a sentinel in mourning. The hours crept by, and the temperature dropped further. Frost glistened on the petals of the nearby flowers, and the world around him seemed to hold its breath. Terry's body shivered, but he did not move. He couldn't. This grave had become his post, and there was a duty etched deep within his weary heart. By the time the first light of dawn brushed against the sky, painting it in pale hues of pink and orange, the town's cemetery caretaker, an elderly man named Walter, arrived. His breath puffed in clouds as he walked, humming an old hymn. He stopped abruptly at the sight of Terry, curled up beside Samuel's grave, eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and pity. Walter approached cautiously, recognizing the dog from around town. He knelt down, feeling a tightness in his chest at the sight of Terry's thin frame and the unwavering gaze that spoke of a pain only shared by those who had loved and lost. "Hey there, boy," Walter whispered, extending a hand. But Terry's eyes only flickered briefly before returning to the gravestone, as if to say, "This is where I belong now." The old man stood, tears pricking the corners of his eyes as he felt the silent story unfold before him, a story of companionship, of loyalty that refused to fade even in the face of death. The day dragged on, and Terry remained steadfast by Samuel's grave. Visitors to the cemetery noticed the thin, matted stray, but instead of shooing him away, they observed with quiet awe. Whispers of the guardian dog rippled through the small town, carried on soft conversations at the bakery, hushed exchanges in the local market, and murmurs in the pews of the church where Samuel once sat. Terry's presence was more than just a symbol of loyalty, it was a reminder of grief shared. But despite the growing attention, Terry was struggling. His ribs jutted sharply beneath his thinning coat, evidence of days spent without proper food. Walter, the cemetery caretaker, felt a growing responsibility for the creature who seemed so inexplicably bound to Samuel. Every day, he would bring scraps of bread and meat, trying to coax the dog to eat. "You need to eat, boy," Walter would whisper, placing the food gently near the grave. Yet Terry, despite his evident hunger, would barely touch it. His watch was unwavering, his hunger and thirst pushed aside for the duty he had claimed as his own. Across town, In the house Samuel once called home, his mother, Grace, moved through the days like a shadow of her former self. The walls of her living room were lined with pictures of Samuel, his bright eyes and infectious smile a painful reminder of what was lost. Grief settled in every corner of the house, suffocating and relentless. She had heard the stories of the stray dog in the cemetery, but grief had dulled her curiosity and empathy, reducing her world to a cycle of aching memories. It wasn't until a neighbor came by one afternoon, their eyes wide with urgency, that Grace was stirred from her numbed state. "You need to see this, Grace. There's a dog that won't leave Samuel's grave. It's as if he's guarding him," they said, voice trembling with a mix of astonishment and sorrow. Reluctantly, Grace made her way to the cemetery, her heart heavy with the weight of loss and the strange hope that there might be something left of Samuel to be found. As she approached, she saw Terry, curled tightly against the grave, his eyes tired yet vigilant. The sight was enough to break the thin walls she had built around her heart. Tears streamed silently down her face as she watched the animal, his devotion so deep, so pure, it was almost as if he carried Samuel's soul within him. Walter, noticing her approach, stepped aside respectfully. "He's been here every day," he said softly. "Refuses to leave, no matter the cold or hunger." Grace knelt slowly, the cold earth biting at her knees as she reached out a trembling hand. Terry lifted his head, eyes meeting hers with a knowing look that sent shivers down her spine. In that moment, she understood that this creature had not just wandered here by chance. He was here because Samuel had loved him, even in the smallest, unnoticed ways that meant everything to a stray. A shiver ran through Terry as Grace's hand brushed the top of his head. It was warm, a comfort he hadn't known in what felt like a lifetime. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to relax, pressing into her touch as if recognizing the bond they now shared through their mutual grief. But not everyone in town understood. Some saw the dog's presence as a nuisance, a reminder of decay and death. Rumors began circulating that perhaps it was time to remove the dog, to maintain the dignity of the cemetery. Grace, hearing these whispers, felt a surge of protectiveness she hadn't felt since losing Samuel. She knew she had to act, not just for the dog, but for the memory of her son, who had loved without condition. The conflict had now grown from silent mourning to a struggle for understanding and acceptance. Terry was no longer just a stray. He was a symbol, a living connection to Samuel's legacy of kindness and love. As the days passed, Terry's presence became a topic of both concern and wonder. Some townspeople viewed the dog's loyalty as an extraordinary display of devotion, while others were uncomfortable with the disruption it represented in a place meant for solemnity and peace. Murmurs of removing Terry grew louder, especially among those who held positions of authority in town. One crisp afternoon, a council member named Henry, known for his strict adherence to rules and order, approached Walter at the cemetery. His expression was stern, eyes narrowing as he pointed at Terry lying by Samuel's grave. "Walter, we can't keep allowing this. The cemetery is a place of respect, not for stray animals to roam freely. It's time he goes." Walter's heart ached at the thought. He had grown attached to Terry, seeing in him a guardian of memories, a keeper of unspoken promises. "Henry, he's not harming anyone. Look at him. This dog is part of Samuel's story. Removing him would be wrong." Grace overheard the conversation from where she stood nearby, her hands clenched at her sides. The idea of losing this connection to her son, the only tangible link left, ignited a fire in her heart. Without hesitation, she stepped forward. "If you're thinking of taking him away, you'll have to go through me first," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. Henry's expression shifted from surprise to annoyance. "Grace, I understand you're grieving, but this is about maintaining dignity. A stray doesn't belong here." "Samuel would disagree," Grace countered, tears glistening in her eyes but not falling. "That dog isn't just any stray. He's a testament to my son's kindness, to the love he shared even when no one was watching. Removing him would be erasing a part of who Samuel was." A crowd had gathered by now, drawn by the raised voices and the palpable tension. Some nodded in agreement with Grace, their eyes misty as they remembered Samuel's gentle ways. Others exchanged uncertain glances, torn between the need for decorum and the undeniable bond between the woman and the dog. It was then that Terry stood up, his tired legs trembling slightly. He looked from Grace to the crowd, his eyes deep and searching as if he could sense the significance of the moment. He moved closer to Grace and pressed his head against her leg, as if to say, "I am here, and so is he." A hush fell over the cemetery. The crowd felt it, the shared silence that spoke of unspoken words, a recognition of love and loyalty that transcended life itself. Henry, seeing the reaction and feeling the weight of the moment, sighed heavily. "Fine. But he stays only if he's taken care of," he said, giving Walter and Grace a meaningful look. "The town won't tolerate neglect or disruption." Relief washed over Grace as she knelt to hug Terry, her fingers weaving through his scruffy fur. "We'll take care of him," she promised, both to Henry and to the memory of her son. From that day on, things began to change. Grace visited the cemetery daily, bringing warm meals for Terry and sharing stories of Samuel. Walter, in his quiet way, kept an eye on them both, making sure that neither rain nor the cold nights would force Terry away from his post. But the true turning point was the day Terry, sensing the warmth in Grace's presence, followed her home after a visit. Grace paused at her front porch, looking back at the dog who had been a silent guardian. She knelt, tears streaming freely for the first time in weeks, and whispered, "Come on, boy. Samuel would want you to be warm." Terry hesitated only a moment before stepping inside, finding a space in the corner where Samuel's old blanket lay, still holding a faint scent that made him whine softly in recognition. It was a place he could rest, not just his body but the weight he had carried since Samuel's passing. And for Grace, it was a beginning, a small piece of healing, knowing that Samuel's love had found a way to live on. As winter tightened its grip on the small town, the bond between Terry and Grace grew deeper. Grace, who once found herself waking up to silence and emptiness, now rose each morning to the sight of Terry curled up on Samuel's old blanket, his chest rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. It felt like a small piece of Samuel's warmth had returned, filling the corners of her home that grief had once occupied. Terry, too, began to change. His once dull and ragged coat gained a healthy shine, and his eyes lost some of their haunted, faraway look. With each meal that Grace lovingly prepared, with each gentle pat and word of comfort, Terry grew stronger. The townspeople, witnessing this transformation, couldn't help but soften their opinions. Children would wave when they saw Terry walking beside Grace, and shopkeepers would offer scraps and treats as he passed by with his newfound guardian. But life wasn't without its trials. The winter brought with it biting winds and freezing nights that seeped through the walls of even the sturdiest houses. One particularly fierce storm hit the town, bringing with it snow that piled in drifts higher than the fences. The power flickered in and out, and many were confined to their homes. Grace, despite her efforts to keep warm, felt the chill seep into her bones. She huddled by the fireplace, with Terry at her feet, his body heat providing a comfort she hadn't known she needed. The storm howled outside, rattling windows and shaking the shutters, but inside, Grace felt safe for the first time since Samuel's passing. It was as if Terry's silent vigil now extended to her, protecting not just the memory of Samuel but also the mother who had loved him so deeply. The storm raged for days, and supplies in the house began to dwindle. Terry, sensing Grace's growing unease, paced the small home restlessly. On the third day, the roads cleared enough for Walter to make his way to Grace's home. He arrived with a bundle of firewood and bags of food, his face flushed from the cold but smiling. "I figured you two could use a little help," he said, eyes twinkling as Terry barked a greeting, his tail wagging with gratitude. As Walter settled in to help stoke the fire and share stories of Samuel, Grace felt an unexpected warmth spread through her. The isolation she had once felt had been replaced by community and shared memory. Terry curled up beside them, eyes closing as if finally at peace. With the storm past, life slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Terry became a fixture in the town's heart, a living tribute to the kindness and loyalty Samuel had shown in life. Grace took him on walks to the cemetery, where they would sit by Samuel's grave, not in grief but in quiet remembrance. Terry would press his nose to the gravestone, as if to say, "I'm here. I remember." One day, as the first signs of spring pushed through the melting snow, Grace visited the grave with Terry and found a note tucked into a bouquet of wildflowers. It read, "For Terry, who taught us that love never dies. And for Samuel, who reminded us to be kind." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but they were not just of sadness. They were of gratitude for a love that had transcended loss and found a way to keep living. The town, inspired by the story of Terry and Samuel, began a tradition. Each spring, they held a small gathering at the cemetery where they would share stories of loved ones and celebrate acts of kindness. It was a day marked not by mourning, but by the joy of remembering and the hope that comes with new beginnings. Terry, now older but no less devoted, would sit by Grace's side, his ears perked as he listened to the voices of the people Samuel had once known. In his quiet way, he was still watching over them, still holding vigil for the boy who had shown him that even the smallest act of love could last forever. As time moved forward, the story of Terry and Samuel became a cherished part of the town's history. Grace, though still bearing the ache of her son's absence, found solace in the moments shared with Terry. His unwavering presence had transformed her days, replacing loneliness with purpose. Through Terry, she had learned that love didn't end. It adapted, found new forms, and persevered even in the darkest times. The annual spring gathering blossomed into an event that brought warmth and healing. Families would come together to share stories of love, loss, and resilience. Grace would often stand quietly at the edge, hand resting on Terry's head, feeling Samuel's spirit in every shared laugh and tearful smile. The town's once somber cemetery now resonated with life, and each grave held not just memories of parting, but also stories of connection and hope. Terry, now gray around the muzzle but still vibrant in spirit, continued his quiet vigil beside Grace. He would look out over the gathering with eyes that had seen both pain and joy, and a heart that had carried the weight of loss and the relief of finding a new home. One evening, as the sun set in hues of gold and violet, Grace sat beside Samuel's grave with Terry by her side. She whispered into the breeze, "Thank you, Samuel, for sending him to me." Terry leaned into her, a silent guardian, as the last light of day bathed them in a gentle glow. And in that peaceful moment, surrounded by the love that still lingered, it was clear, loyalty and love, no matter how quietly kept, could bridge any distance, even that between life and the hereafter. It's an honor to be able to create content for you. If you want to support the channel even more, you can follow the instructions that I will leave on the pinned comment. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Love you all.